Welcome to World Rare Coins Vault, where we uncover fascinating coins from the past and explore their potential value. Today, we're looking at top 5 rare UK 1 penny coins, including the 1940 penny in damaged condition, 1946 in fine condition, 1967 circulated penny, 1962 old condition coin, and 1964 outdated condition penny. Could one of these coins be worth far more than you expect? Stay with us until the end to discover which penny stands out. The year 1940 to examine a British 1 penny, a coin that may look ordinary at first glance, but carries a history of wartime Britain in every detail. And there is one important point to remember from the beginning. A coin does not need to be perfect to be interesting. Sometimes, even a worn or damaged old coin can attract attention because of its age, historical connection, and the story it carries. So, if you have an old 1940 penny somewhere in a collection, a drawer, an inherited box of coins, or an old family keepsake, stay with us because we're going to take a detailed journey through this fascinating piece and explain what collectors would look for when judging its potential value. The 1940 British 1 penny was issued during a remarkable period in British history. Britain was in the middle of the Second World War, and everyday life was changing rapidly. Coins were being produced for ordinary transactions, passing through shops, markets, banks, and countless hands across the country. The penny was one of the most familiar denominations in British currency, and the 1940 issue belongs to the reign of King George VI. That historical background gives this coin an extra layer of interest for collectors. When you hold a 1940 penny today, you are not simply holding an old piece of bronze. You are holding an object that was circulating during one of the most important periods of the 20th century. Imagine this penny being used in Britain more than 8 decades ago, perhaps buying a small item from a local shop or being placed into a pocket before traveling through the streets of wartime Britain. That sense of history is one of the reasons old coins continue to attract collectors around the world. Turning our attention to the front of the coin, or what collectors commonly call the obverse, we see the portrait of King George VI. His portrait face is left, and around it are inscriptions identifying the monarch and his title. The design was created by the renowned British sculptor and medalist Thomas Humphrey Paget, whose work appears on a number of British coins from the period. On an old example such as this, the portrait can show considerable wear, particularly around the highest points of the design. The details of the king's hair, facial features, and surrounding lettering may become softer over decades of circulation. This is completely normal for a circulated coin, and on a damaged example, those details can be even less distinct. Nevertheless, the portrait remains one of the most recognizable features of this historic penny, linking the coin directly to the reign of George VI. Now let's turn the coin over and examine the reverse, sometimes informally called the tail side. The reverse features the famous seated figure of Britannia, one of the most recognizable symbols associated with British coinage. Britannia is shown seated, holding a trident and shield, with the sea and lighthouse elements forming part of the traditional design. The word 1 penny appears as part of the denomination design, while the date identifies a particular year of issue. Britannia had already been appearing on British pennies for generations, making this design part of a much larger tradition in British numismatic history. When you compare an old 1940 penny with modern British coins, the difference in artistic style is immediately noticeable. The coin has a strong traditional character, with a design intended not only to identify its denomination, but also to represent Britain itself. The physical specifications of a coin are another important part of understanding it. The standard 1940 British penny was made from a bronze composition and weighed approximately 9.45 grams, with a diameter of roughly 30.8 millimeters. Its substantial size compared with many modern small denomination coins is one reason these old pennies feel particularly impressive in the hand. Of course, an individual damaged or heavily circulated example may weigh slightly less today because of surface wear, corrosion, cleaning, or other forms of deterioration. That is why collectors should not rely on weight alone when identifying a coin. Diameter, design, lettering, edge characteristics, metal composition, and overall appearance should all be considered together. If you discover an old penny and suspect that something unusual may be present, careful measurement can be useful, but professional identification is always preferable before making claims about rarity or value. Now we come to perhaps the most important subject for anyone watching this video: rarity and condition. The 1940 penny is certainly an old and historically interesting British coin, but simply being from 1940 does not automatically make every example extremely rare or worth thousands of dollars. This distinction is very important for collectors. The value of an individual coin can depend on factors such as surviving numbers, condition, demand, visual quality, originality, unusual characteristics, and whether the coin has an important recognized variety or error. In our example today, we are specifically discussing a damaged condition 1940 penny. Damage can include scratches, dents, corrosion, staining, heavy surface marks, or other problems that occurred after the coin entered circulation. Such damage generally reduces collector value, compared with a well-preserved example. However, that does not erase the coin's historical importance. A genuine 1940 penny with substantial, where it can still be an enjoyable and affordable addition to a collection, particularly for someone interested in British wartime coinage. This is also where the idea of a coin being described online as a $1 million penny or a $1,000 treasure needs to be treated carefully. For entertainment purposes, you may see dramatic hypothetical figures attached to old coins. For example, imagine a fictional auction scenario where an exceptional and extremely unusual 1940 penny is presented to enthusiastic collectors, and a dramatic bid reaches $1,000, then $5,000, and finally an imaginary $10,000. That would certainly make an exciting story, but these figures should not be interpreted as the normal market value of a damaged 1940 penny. They are fictional examples designed to illustrate how extraordinary rarity, authentication, and intense collector demand could theoretically change the value of a coin. The real market value of an ordinary damaged 1940 penny is generally expected to be much more modest, and its exact worth depends heavily on its actual condition and characteristics. So, what might the current market value in dollars look like? Rather than giving a misleading single figure, it is better to think in terms of condition and collector interest. A heavily damaged or worn 1940 penny may have a relatively low collector value, especially if it has no unusual variety or error. A cleaner, circulated example can attract more interest, while a particularly well-preserved original specimen can be considerably more desirable. Exceptional examples with recognized varieties or errors can potentially command much stronger prices, but those cases need proper authentication. To put the dramatic side into perspective, our fictional collector show scenario could imagine values such as $100, $500, $1,000, $5,000, or even $10,000 for increasingly extraordinary examples. These numbers are illustrative fictional values, not guaranteed or typical market prices. The real value of your particular coin should be determined by examining the coin itself and comparing it with genuine market evidence. One of the most exciting things about collecting is that you never know what you might discover. A coin that appears ordinary at first glance can sometimes reveal an unusual feature when examined under good lighting and magnification. Collectors should carefully inspect the date, lettering, portrait, Britannia design, rim, and edge. Look for unusual doubling, strange shapes missing details, abnormal spacing, or other features that appear different from a normal example. However, genuine mint errors should not be confused with ordinary damage. A scratch created after the coin left the mint is not normally considered a valuable minting error. Similarly, dents, corrosion, and cleaning marks are not automatically signs of rarity. The key is learning the difference between something that happened during manufacturing and something that happened during decades of circulation. Another important tip is to avoid aggressively cleaning an old coin. It can be tempting to make a dark or dirty penny look bright and shiny, but polishing, rubbing, or using chemicals can permanently damage the original surface. Collectors often appreciate coins with natural surfaces because those surfaces preserve evidence of the coin's history. If you have a 1940 penny that you believe could be unusual, keep it in a safe, dry holder and handle it carefully by the edges. Avoid scratching the surface and do not attempt to manufacture an artificial rare appearance. Authenticity and originality are far more important than making an old coin look new. It is also worth remembering that condition is a major part of the story. A damaged coin may have scratches, dents, or corrosion that dramatically affect its appearance, while another coin from exactly the same year may have much sharper details. Two pennies with the same date can therefore have completely different levels of collector interest. The difference becomes even more important when a coin has a recognized variety or error. In those circumstances, collectors may be willing to pay significantly more for a better preserved example, but the coin must first be correctly identified. Never assume that a strange-looking mark means the coin is a rare error. Careful comparison with trusted numismatic references and, for potentially valuable pieces, professional authentication can make a huge difference. The 1940 penny also reminds us why historical coins remain fascinating long after their original purchasing power has disappeared. When this penny was produced, the world was experiencing enormous change. The people who handled it could never have imagined that decades later collectors would be examining the same coin under magnifying glasses and discussing its historical significance. The coin survived the everyday world of the 1940s and traveled through generations to reach collectors today. That journey itself is part of its value. Even when the financial value is modest, the historical value and personal connection can make an old coin special. And now, as we come toward the end of today's coin journey, let's imagine placing this 1940 penny on a collector's table. The surface shows its age. The edges may reveal damage. The portrait may have lost some of its original sharpness, and Britannia may show the effects of decades of circulation. Yet the date 1940 remains visible, connecting the coin to a remarkable chapter of British history. It is a reminder that rarity is not simply about age. True collector interest comes from a combination of history, scarcity, condition, authenticity, design, demand, and sometimes an unusual feature that separates one coin from thousands of others. So, if you have a 1940 British one penny, don't immediately throw it aside just because it is damaged. Take a closer look. Check the date. Examine both sides. Inspect the edge. Compare the design with authenticated examples. And if something genuinely unusual catches your eye, consider having the coin examined by an experienced numismatist or professional grading and authentication service. And remember, the exciting fictional figures, such as $1,000, $5,000, or $10,000 that we mentioned today are entertainment examples, not promises of what a damaged 1940 penny will sell for. The real excitement comes from discovering what you actually have. Next up, the British one penny from 1946, an interesting post-war coin from the reign of King George VI. Our example is described as being in fine condition, which makes it particularly interesting because it has survived decades while still retaining a reasonable amount of its original design detail. Could an old 1946 penny hiding in a collection be more interesting than it first appears? Could unusual characteristics, excellent preservation, or strong collector demand make one example stand apart from another? In this video, we are going to explore the history, design, weight, condition, rarity, and possible market interest of this fascinating British penny, while also looking at some dramatic fictional high-value scenarios that show just how exciting the world of rare coins can become. The year 1946 is especially interesting because it came immediately after the end of the Second World War. Britain was entering a new period, but the effects of the war were still visible throughout everyday life. The country was rebuilding. People were returning to normal routines, and traditional British coinage continued to play an important role in daily transactions. A penny such as this could have traveled through shops, markets, public transport, and households across Britain. It may have been held by workers, families, children, and shopkeepers before eventually disappearing into a collection or being passed from one generation to another. That is part of the fascination surrounding a coin like this. More than 70 years later, the piece in front of us gives collectors a tangible connection to the period immediately following one of the most significant events in modern history. The 1946 penny belongs to the reign of King George VI, whose portrait appears on the obverse of the coin. The king's left-facing portrait was designed by Thomas Humphrey Paget, a highly respected British medalist whose work became an important part of British coinage during the period. Around the portrait are inscriptions identifying the monarch and his royal title. On a fine condition example, the portrait should still show a reasonable amount of detail, although some areas may display the normal signs of circulation. The higher points of the portrait can gradually become smoother as the coin passes through many hands. When you look closely at the face, hair, and surrounding lettering, you can begin to see the difference between a heavily worn coin and one that has maintained a stronger level of detail. For collectors, these small differences can be extremely important when evaluating an old penny. Turn the coin over and the reverse presents one of the most famous designs in British numismatic history. Here we find Britannia, seated and holding her traditional symbols, including the trident and shield. The figure represents Britain and has appeared on British coinage for generations. The denomination 1 penny is incorporated into the reverse design, while the date 1946 identifies a year in which this particular coin was issued. The combination of Britannia, the traditional lettering, and the historic date creates an immediately recognizable appearance. Even after decades of circulation, a fine example can retain enough of these features to make the design easy to appreciate. This is one reason collectors continue to enjoy older British pennies. They combine practical everyday coinage with artistic designs that reflect Britain's national identity. The physical size and weight of the coin are also worth discussing. The traditional British bronze penny from this period was a substantial coin compared with many modern low-denomination pieces. A standard example weighs approximately 9.45 grams and measures around 30.8 millimeters in diameter. It has a familiar bronze composition associated with British pennies of the era. When you place one of these coins in your hand, its size and weight immediately remind you that historical British currency was designed quite differently from modern decimal coinage. However, collectors should understand that an individual old coin may weigh slightly differently today because of decades of circulation, surface wear, corrosion, or previous handling. Therefore, weight should be used as one identification clue rather than the only test of authenticity. Now we arrive at the question that attracts so much attention from collectors. How rare is the 1946 penny, and what does fine condition actually mean? The first thing to understand is that being old does not automatically mean a coin is extremely rare. Millions of historic coins can survive, and their values can vary significantly. A 1946 penny in fine condition may have noticeable circulation marks, but the main design features should remain recognizable. The portrait lettering, Britannia, and date should still be visible without requiring excessive imagination. Compare with a heavily damaged example. A fine condition coin is naturally more appealing to many collectors because it presents a clearer picture of how the coin originally looked. Condition can make a substantial difference when collectors compare examples. Imagine two 1946 pennies sitting next to one another. The first has heavy scratches, dark corrosion, and very weak details. The second has an attractive natural surface, a clear date, a well-defined portrait, and a stronger Britannia design. Even though both coins carry the same year, they may attract very different levels of interest. This is why serious collectors pay close attention to preservation. A coin's value can also be influenced by originality, eye appeal, rarity, unusual varieties, minting errors, and market demand. If a 1946 penny has an authenticated feature that makes it significantly different from a normal example, that could change the collecting story completely. Now, let's talk about the market value in dollars, because this is where online coin videos can become particularly dramatic. You may see claims suggesting that an old penny is automatically worth thousands or even millions of dollars. Those claims should always be approached with caution. For a normal 1946 British penny in fine condition, it would be misleading to promise a huge price without examining the actual coin and verifying its characteristics. The ordinary value can be much more modest. However, for entertainment purposes, let's imagine an extreme fictional auction scenario. Imagine a remarkable 1946 penny with an exceptionally unusual authenticated feature appearing before a room full of collectors. The bidding begins at $100, rises to $500, then reaches $1,000, followed by $5,000, and finally an imaginary collector offers $10,000 to secure the coin. That would certainly make a thrilling auction story. But these figures are fictional examples and should not be interpreted as the normal market value of a standard fine condition 1946 penny. These dramatic numbers help demonstrate an important principle of coin collecting. Exceptional coins can sometimes behave very differently from ordinary examples. If a coin has a recognized rarity, genuine mint error, unusual variety, exceptional preservation, or strong documented provenance, collectors may compete much more aggressively for it. In a fictional high-demand scenario, we could even imagine a spectacular example being discussed at $20,000 or $50,000. But again, these are illustrative entertainment figures rather than a claim that an ordinary 1946 penny is worth those amounts. The actual value of any coin depends on evidence, condition, authenticity, rarity, and what buyers are genuinely willing to pay in the real marketplace. For someone who owns a 1946 penny, the best approach is not to become obsessed with a dramatic price tag, but to investigate the coin carefully. Begin with the date and make sure the 1946 is clearly visible. Examine the portrait of George VI and look closely at the lettering. Then study Britannia on the reverse and inspect the coin's edge. A magnifying glass can be extremely useful because some features are difficult to see with the naked eye. Look for unusual doubling, strange lettering, irregular shapes or characteristics that appear different from a normal example. But remember that a scratch, dent, or post-mint damage is not automatically a valuable mint error. Understanding this difference can save collectors from many false assumptions. Another important piece of advice is to protect the coin's original surface. If you discover a 1946 penny in fine condition, avoid aggressively polishing or cleaning it. Using abrasive materials or chemicals can leave permanent marks and may reduce its appeal to collectors. An old coin does not need to shine like a brand new modern coin. Natural aging and original surfaces can be part of the coin's character. Store the penny somewhere dry and safe, preferably in an appropriate coin holder that does not expose it unnecessarily to moisture, dirt, or harsh materials. Handle it carefully, ideally by the edges, especially if you are dealing with a better preserved example. Collectors should also learn to compare their coins with authenticated examples rather than relying only on photographs or sensational online claims. A genuine rarity should have identifiable characteristics that can be explained and verified. If your 1946 penny appears to have something unusual, consider consulting a reputable coin dealer, experienced numismatist, or professional authentication and grading service. This is particularly important if someone claims that the coin could be worth thousands of dollars. Before believing a dramatic valuation, ask what specific feature makes the coin rare, whether that feature is recognized by established numismatic references, and whether there is reliable evidence of comparable sales. There's also something special about the idea of a fine-condition 1946 penny surviving from the post-war era. Think about the number of years this little coin has passed through. It has survived changing governments, changing technology, changing fashions, and an entirely different monetary system. Britain eventually moved from pounds, shillings, and pence to decimal currency. Yet this old penny remained as a physical reminder of the earlier system. A collector holding it today can almost imagine the world in which it once circulated. That historical connection is one of the strongest reasons old coins continue to attract enthusiasts. And this is why the 1946 penny deserves attention, even when its ordinary market value is not spectacular. Coin collecting is not only about finding a coin worth $1,000, $5,000, or $10,000. It is also about discovering history, understanding craftsmanship, and preserving objects that have survived from another generation. A coin can be financially modest, but historically fascinating. At the same time, a careful collector never knows when an unusual variety or authenticated error might turn an ordinary-looking piece into something considerably more interesting. So, if you have a 1946 British 1 penny in fine condition, take another look before putting it away. Check the portrait. Inspect Britannia. Study the lettering and confirm the date. Measure the coin if necessary. But remember that weight alone cannot prove rarity. Keep the surface natural. Avoid cleaning and protect the coin from moisture and unnecessary handling. Most importantly, don't let sensational claims convince you that every old penny is automatically a fortune. The real excitement comes from identifying what makes your particular coin special. As we finish today's journey, the 1946 British penny stands before us as a small but fascinating survivor from a changing Britain. Its George VI portrait represents the monarchy of the period, Britannia represents the nation, and the date 1946 places the coin firmly in important years following the Second World War. In fine condition, it can still display enough detail to appreciate the craftsmanship that went into its design. And while fictional auction stories involving $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, or even higher amounts can make an exciting collector show scenario, the real value must always come from the individual coin's verified rarity, condition, and genuine market demand. A British one penny from 1967, a coin that belongs to the final years of Britain's pre-decimal currency system. At first glance, a circulated 1967 penny might look like an ordinary old coin that has simply spent years passing from hand to hand. But when you look more closely, this little piece of bronze becomes a fascinating reminder of Britain before decimalization. Its age, design, condition, historical background, and potential collector interest all make it worth examining carefully. So, if you have a 1967 penny sitting in an old collection, a family box, a jar of coins, or somewhere in the back of a drawer, stay with us because we're going to explore what makes this coin interesting and what could potentially make one example stand out from another. The year 1967 was an important period in British monetary history. Britain was still using the traditional pounds, shillings, and pence system, and a familiar penny was an essential part of everyday life. The country was going through major social and economic changes, while preparations for Britain's future decimal currency system were already becoming increasingly important. The 1967 penny therefore belongs to the closing chapter of an old monetary tradition. Just a few years later, Britain would move to decimal currency, changing the way people thought about pounds and pence. For collectors today, this gives the 1967 penny an additional historical attraction. It represents the final era of a currency system that had existed in Britain for centuries, making even an ordinary circulated example an interesting survivor of a rapidly changing world. When we examine the front of the coin or the obverse, we see the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, who was Britain's reigning monarch in 1967. The portrait on this pre-decimal penny was created by the renowned British artist and sculptor Arnold Machin. Her Majesty faces to the right, wearing a coronet, with the surrounding inscription identifying her as Elizabeth II and Queen by the grace of God. The portrait is one of the most recognizable elements of British coinage from this era. On a circulated example, however, the highest points of the design can become noticeably smoother. Years of contact with other coins, pockets, purses, and countless hands can gradually reduce the sharpness of portrait. Nevertheless, even a worn example can retain the distinctive shape and character of the young Queen Elizabeth II portrait. Turn the coin over and you encounter one of the most famous symbols in British coinage, Britannia. She is seated proudly, holding her traditional trident and shield, with the sea and lighthouse in the background. The reverse design continues a long British tradition, in which Britannia represents the strength and identity of the nation. The denomination 1 penny is clearly incorporated into the design, while the date 1967 appears at the bottom. For collectors, this combination of a young Queen Elizabeth II portrait on one side and the traditional Britannia design on the other creates an attractive link between modern British history and centuries-old symbolism. Even when the coin has been circulated, the basic design can remain remarkably recognizable. The physical characteristics of this penny are also important when identifying it. A standard British penny of this era was made from bronze, with a weight of approximately 9.4 grams and a diameter of around 30.8 millimeters. It is a substantial coin compared with many modern low-denomination coins. Holding a pre-decimal penny can immediately give you a sense of how different Britain's old currency system was from the decimal money used today. However, collectors should remember that a circulated coin may weigh slightly less than its original specification because of natural wear, scratches, corrosion, or other damage accumulated during its lifetime. Weight should therefore be treated as one part of identification rather than proof of rarity on its own. Now we come to the subject that makes collectors most curious: rarity and condition. A 1967 penny is historically interesting, but the fact that it is old does not automatically mean that every example is rare or extremely valuable. Large numbers of pennies were produced for everyday circulation, and many examples have survived. Our particular example is described as being in circulated condition, meaning it has clearly experienced use. You may notice softer details on Queen Elizabeth II portrait, where across Britannia, marks on the fields, and perhaps some small scratches or color changes. These signs of circulation tell us that the coin actually spent part of its life performing the job for which it was made. For collectors, condition can make a significant difference. Imagine placing a heavily worn 1967 penny beside an example with crisp details, attractive natural surfaces, and minimal marks. Both have the same date, but the better preserved example may be considerably more desirable. This is why collectors examine the condition of the portrait, lettering, Britannia, rim, and overall surface. They also look for unusual varieties, genuine minting errors, and other characteristics that could separate one coin from the ordinary examples. A circulated coin can still be fascinating, and if it has an unusual feature that is confirmed as a genuine mint error or variety, its collecting story can become much more interesting. The question everyone wants answered is, of course, what is a 1967 penny worth today in dollars? This is where we need to separate exciting collector stories from realistic valuation. A normal circulated 1967 British penny should not automatically be described as a coin worth thousands of dollars. Its actual value depends on condition, authenticity, rarity, demand, and whether there's any recognized unusual characteristics. For an ordinary circulated example, the value may be relatively modest, but imagine, purely as a fictional collector show scenario, that an exceptionally unusual 1967 penny appeared at a major auction. Perhaps it had a spectacular and professionally authenticated minting error. The bidding could dramatically move from $100 to $500, then to $1,000, followed by $5,000, and in our fictional story, perhaps even $10,000. These figures sound exciting, but they are illustrative fictional values rather than a claim that a standard circulated 1967 penny sells for those amounts. To take the dramatic scenario even further, imagine a fictional example that possesses an extremely unusual and authenticated feature that makes collectors compete intensely. The auctioneer announces $10,000. Another bidder raises it to $20,000. And suddenly the room becomes silent as one determined collector offers $50,000. That would certainly be a spectacular story for a rare coin program. However, these numbers should be understood as entertainment examples only. They are not a normal market valuation for a circulated 1967 penny. Real coin prices must be supported by genuine evidence, recognized varieties or errors, authentication, and actual transactions. A responsible collector should never assume that a coin is worth thousands simply because a dramatic online video mentions a large number. So what should you actually look for if you have one of these pennies? Start by examining the 1967 date closely. Make sure the numbers are genuine and have not been altered. Then study Queen Elizabeth II portrait under good lighting. Look carefully at the lettering around the portrait and compare it with a normal authenticated example. On the reverse, inspect Britannia's trident shield clothing surrounding details and the lettering of one penny. Look at the rim and edge as well. Sometimes unusual features can be difficult to see without magnification, so a good quality magnifying glass can be an extremely useful tool for collectors. One of the biggest mistakes new collectors make is confusing damage with a genuine mint error. A deep scratch, dent, gouge, or unusual mark might look dramatic, but may have happened after the coin left the mint. Genuine mint errors occur during the manufacturing process and can have specific characteristics that specialists recognize. If something looks unusual, don't immediately assume it is valuable. Compare it carefully with known examples, and if the potential value appears significant, seek professional advice. This simple step can prevent disappointment and can also help protect genuinely interesting coins from being incorrectly handled. Another important tip is do not clean the coin aggressively. A circulated 1967 penny may have darkened naturally over the decades, and that natural appearance can be part of its character. Scrubbing, polishing, or applying chemicals can leave permanent marks and may reduce collector appeal. Instead, handle the coin carefully by its edges and store it in a suitable coin holder or protective container. Keeping it away from excessive moisture, harsh chemicals, and unnecessary handling can help preserve a condition it has today. Collectors should also keep good records. If you have several old British pennies, write down the dates and any unusual features you notice. Photographing both sides of the coin can also be useful for comparison. Over time, you'll become more familiar with differences in portraits, lettering, surfaces, and designs. The more coins you examine, the easier it becomes to recognize what is normal and what genuinely deserves further investigation. The fascinating thing about a 1967 penny is that its story is connected to a major change in British everyday life. People using this coin in 1967 were living in a Britain that still counted money in pounds, shillings, and pence. The familiar system of 12 pennies to a shilling and 20 shillings to a pound was still part of everyday life. Yet only a few years later, decimalization would transform British currency. When you hold a 1967 penny today, you are holding a small reminder of that earlier monetary world. It may have bought something simple decades ago, but now it can serve as a historical object that tells us about the society and economy of its time. This is also why coin collecting is about much more than finding a fortune. Of course, discovering a genuinely rare error or exceptional variety can be thrilling, but the historical journey of an ordinary coin can be equally fascinating. A circulated penny may have passed through dozens or even hundreds of hands. It may have traveled between towns, sat in a shopkeeper's till, been carried home by a child, or remained forgotten in a family collection for decades. Every mark on its surface can be a small reminder that this was once an active piece of everyday money. When assessing possible market value, remember that several factors work together. The date matters, but is only the starting point. Condition matters because sharper and better preserved examples generally attract greater collector interest. Authenticity is essential. A genuine unusual feature can make a significant difference, while ordinary damage usually does not. Collector demand can also change over time. A coin that receives little attention today may become more interesting to collectors in the future, particularly if research reveals a previously overlooked variety. This is why serious collectors concentrate on learning rather than simply chasing dramatic price claims. So, if you have a 1967 British 1 penny in circulated condition, don't dismiss it simply because it does not look shiny or new. Examine it carefully and appreciate what it represents. Check the Queen Elizabeth II portrait. Study Britannia. Confirm the date and look for anything genuinely unusual. Keep the coin protected. Avoid cleaning it and don't rely on sensational claims about thousands of dollars without evidence. If you believe your example has an unusual mint feature, professional examination can provide a much clearer answer. And as we bring today's journey to a close, the 1967 penny remains a fascinating piece of Britain's numismatic history. It carries the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, the traditional image of Britannia, and the date that places it firmly in the final years of Britain's old pre-decimal currency. A circulated example may show the marks of everyday life, but those marks are also part of its story. It survived an era of enormous change and has now become a small piece of history for today's collectors. The fictional figures we mentioned, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, and even $50,000, make for an exciting high-demand auction story, but they should never be treated as guaranteed prices for a normal circulated 1967 penny. The real value of your coin depends on its exact characteristics: condition, rarity, authenticity, and genuine buyer demand. The most exciting discovery is not simply seeing a large dollar figure on a screen. It is finding out what your own coin actually is. Next up, the British 1 penny from 1962, an old pre-decimal coin from the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Our example is described as being in old condition, showing the natural signs of age and circulation that can appear after decades of survival. At first glance, this may seem like an ordinary old penny, but there is much more to explore when we look closely at its history, design, physical characteristics, condition, and potential collector interest. Could a 1962 penny hiding in an old collection be worth more than expected? Could an unusual variety or genuine minting error make one example stand apart? Stay with us as we take a detailed journey through this fascinating coin and discover what collectors should really look for. The year 1962 takes us back to a very different Britain. Queen Elizabeth II had been on the throne for less than a decade, and Britain was still using the traditional pounds, shillings, and pence system. The decimal currency that we know today was still several years away. Everyday transactions were carried out using familiar denominations such as farthings, halfpennies, pennies, threepences, sixpences, shillings, and half-crowns. The penny was one of the most recognizable pieces of everyday money and could be found in shops, markets, homes, and pockets throughout the country. A 1962 penny, therefore, represents more than a denomination. It is a small surviving piece of a monetary system that would eventually disappear as Britain moved towards decimalization. Think about the journey that a coin like this could have taken. When it was new in 1962, its bronze surface would have been considerably brighter and its design sharper. It could have been used by a shopper, a worker, a child, or a shopkeeper. It may have passed through countless hands before eventually being placed in a drawer or collection. More than 6 decades later, that same coin can still be examined today. The marks, color changes, and wear that you see may be evidence of its long journey. For collectors, this history is one of the most enjoyable aspects of old coin collecting. You are not simply looking at metal. You are looking at an object that has survived from another era. On the front of the coin, or obverse, we see the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. The young queen faces to the right and wears a coronet. This portrait was designed by Mary Gillick, whose famous portrait appeared on Britain's early decimal and pre-decimal coinage during the beginning of Elizabeth II's reign. Around the portrait is the royal inscription identifying the monarch. On an old and circulated example, some of the finer details may have become softer through years of use. The hair, facial features, and lettering may no longer have the sharp appearance seen on a freshly struck coin, but the overall portrait remains immediately recognizable. For collectors, the condition of these details can provide useful information when judging how heavily a particular penny has circulated. Now turn the coin over and we find the traditional figure Britannia, seated proudly and holding her familiar symbols. She carries a trident and shield, while the background includes the sea and lighthouse elements associated with this long-running British design. The words 1 penny identify the denomination, while the date 1962 appears below. Britannia had been a familiar presence on British coinage for generations, and her appearance on this penny creates a direct connection between the coin and centuries of British numismatic tradition. Even on an old condition example, the broad features of Britannia can usually still be appreciated. The design reminds us that British coins were not merely practical objects, but also carried symbols of national identity. The size and weight of this penny are also worth considering. A standard British bronze penny from this period weighed approximately 9.45 grams and measured around 30.8 millimeters across. That makes it a substantial coin compared with many modern low-value denominations. The bronze composition gives it a distinctive appearance, particularly when natural aging has changed the original color. A coin that has spent decades in circulation may weigh slightly differently today because of wear, corrosion, or surface loss. So collectors should not rely on weight alone when determining authenticity. Diameter, design, lettering, edge characteristics, and overall appearance should all be considered together. Now we reach the part that every collector wants to know about: rarity and condition. The fact that a coin is from 1962 makes it historic, but it does not automatically make every 1962 penny rare or extremely valuable. Large quantities of British pennies were produced for everyday circulation, and many examples have survived. Our particular example is described as being in old condition, meaning that it shows visible signs of age, wear, or handling. Perhaps the surfaces have darkened naturally. Perhaps the portrait is softened, or perhaps Britannia has lost some of her finer details. These characteristics do not necessarily make the coin worthless. Instead, they tell us about the coin's journey through time. Condition is one of the most important factors collectors consider. Imagine 2 1962 pennies placed next to each other. One has heavy scratches, significant wear and corrosion, while the other has a clear portrait, stronger lettering, a well-defined Britannia, and an attractive natural surface. Even though the dates are identical, collectors may have very different levels of interest in the two pieces. Better preserved coins generally have greater appeal, especially when they're combined with an unusual variety, error, or other recognized characteristic. But even an old condition penny can be a worthwhile historical collectible, particularly for someone building a collection of British pre-decimal coinage. For example, Let's imagine a completely fictional auction scenario created for entertainment. An unusually interesting 1962 penny is placed under the auctioneer's hammer. The opening bid is $100. Another collector raises it to $500. The bidding continues to $1,000, then $5,000, and finally an enthusiastic bidder offers $10,000. The room becomes excited as the auctioneer asks for another bid. In our fictional story, the coin could even reach $20,000 or $50,000. It possessed an extraordinarily rare and professionally authenticated feature. These numbers are purely illustrative fictional values. They are not the normal market value of an old condition 1962 penny, and they should not be used as a guaranteed price for a coin you own. The reason such dramatic fictional scenarios are interesting is that they demonstrate how rare characteristics can change collector interest. A normal circulated coin is one thing, but an authenticated mint error or recognized variety can be something completely different. If a coin has a feature that specialists know to be scarce, and if the coin is genuine, collectors may compete strongly for it. But this is exactly why authentication matters. A strange mark is not automatically a valuable error. A scratch made during circulation, a dent caused by impact, or corrosion that developed over many years does not normally turn an ordinary penny into a $5,000 coin. If you have a 1962 penny, start by examining the date carefully. Make sure the numbers appear consistent with the normal design and have not been altered. Next, study Queen Elizabeth II portrait under good lighting. Look at the lettering around the portrait and compare the details with a known genuine example. Then turn the coin over and inspect Britannia, the trident, shield, lettering, and date. Pay particular attention to anything that appears genuinely different from the standard design. A magnifying glass can help you see small details that are difficult to notice with the naked eye. It is also important to examine the edge of the coin. Look for unusual damage, irregularities, or characteristics that may provide additional information. However, remember that old coins naturally accumulate marks. The edge can become scratched, dented, or worn through decades of use. Don't assume that every unusual mark represents something created at the mint. Genuine errors have specific characteristics and should be compared against reliable numismatic information before any claim of rarity is made. One of the best habits a collector can develop is to avoid unnecessary cleaning. An old 1962 penny may have a dark brown or aged appearance, and that natural surface can be part of its character. Scrubbing the coin with a cloth, polishing it with metal cleaner, or applying chemicals may permanently damage the surface. Once the original surface has been altered, it cannot simply be restored. If you believe the coin may have collector value, leave it as it is and handle it carefully by the edges. Store it somewhere dry and protected from excessive moisture and harsh environmental conditions. Another useful habit is comparison. If you have several British pennies from different years, place them together and compare the portraits, lettering, reverse designs, dates, and overall condition. This can help you recognize normal versus unusual features. Over time, studying many examples is one of the best ways to develop collector's eye. You begin to notice small differences that may not be obvious when looking at a single coin in isolation. The 1962 penny is particularly interesting because it represents the final years before Britain moved away from its traditional currency system. The old system of pounds, shillings, and pence have been familiar for generations, but the modernization of British currency was approaching. By the early 1970s, decimalization would completely transform everyday money. People who used the 1962 penny would have understood its value within a system that now feels very different. Holding one today gives us a physical connection to that earlier way of life. That historical connection can sometimes be overlooked when people focus entirely on dollar values. A coin does not need to sell for $1,000, $5,000, or $10,000 to be interesting. Its story, age, design, and connection to the past can be valuable to a collector even when its financial price is modest. A 1962 penny survived a world of different technology, different prices, different fashions, and a completely different monetary system. That is what makes it worth examining. At the same time, there is nothing wrong with hoping that your old coin contains something unusual. Coin collecting is exciting precisely because discoveries can happen. If you notice a feature that appears different, don't immediately dismiss it. Take clear photographs. Compare the coin with reliable examples and consider getting an expert opinion. If someone tells you that the coin is worth thousands, ask them to explain exactly why. Is there a recognized variety? Is there a genuine mint error? Is the condition exceptional? Is the coin authenticated? These questions can help separate genuine collecting opportunities from exaggerated claims. When evaluating the possible market value of a 1962 penny, remember that several factors work together. The date identifies the coin, but condition determines how much detail has survived. Originality affects collector appeal. Authenticity is essential. So, if you have a 1962 British one penny in old condition, take a moment to appreciate it. The worn portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, the traditional Britannia design, and the date 1962 all combine to tell a story from Britain's past. It may have been an ordinary coin when it was new, but today it is a surviving piece of pre-decimal British history. The marks and wear may not increase its financial value, but they can make its journey even more fascinating. As we reach the end of today's examination, remember that the dramatic figures we mentioned, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, and $50,000, are fictional high-demand auction examples created for entertainment. They should not be interpreted as normal prices for an old-condition 1962 penny. The genuine market value of any individual coin depends on its exact condition, rarity, authenticity, unusual characteristics, and real collector demand. If your coin appears ordinary, it can still be an enjoyable historical collectible. If it appears unusual, investigate it carefully before making any assumptions. At first sight, an old 1964 penny might appear to be nothing more than a forgotten piece of bronze. But when you take a closer look, it becomes a remarkable reminder of a Britain that used a very different monetary system. Could your 1964 penny contain an unusual characteristic that makes it more interesting to collectors? Could condition, rarity, or a genuine minting error change its potential value? Today, we are going to examine this coin from every important angle and explore its history, design, weight, condition, collector appeal, and possible value in today's dollar market. The year 1964 takes us to an important moment in British history. Queen Elizabeth II was firmly established on the throne, and Britain was still operating under the traditional pounds, shillings, and pence system. Decimalization was still several years away, meaning that the penny was part of a monetary system that had been familiar to British people for generations. A penny was not simply a coin kept by collectors. It was an everyday object that could pass through shops, markets, homes, transport systems, and workplaces. A 1964 penny could have been carried in someone's pocket during an ordinary day, placed in a shopkeeper's till, or saved in a household jar. Today, more than 60 years later, that same type of coin gives collectors a physical connection to an earlier Britain. This historical background makes the 1964 penny particularly enjoyable to study. Think about the world in which it was first produced. Britain was experiencing social and cultural changes. New technology was beginning to transform daily life, and people were still using coins from traditional monetary system that would eventually disappear. When decimalization arrived in the early 1970s, the way people calculated everyday money changed dramatically. The old penny therefore represents more than its denomination. It belongs to the final chapter of a currency tradition that had been part of British life for centuries. Now let's look at the head side, or obverse, of the coin. The 1964 penny carries the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, facing to the right and wearing a coronet. The portrait was created by Mary Gillick, whose work became one of the defining images of early Elizabeth II British coinage. Around the portrait is the royal inscription identifying the Queen. On a well-preserved example, the facial features, hair and lettering can remain relatively clear. On an outdated or heavily circulated example, however, these details may have become softer due to years of handling. The highest points of the portrait are particularly vulnerable to wear, and examining those areas can help collectors understand how much circulation the coin has experienced. The portrait also gives this penny a strong historical identity. Queen Elizabeth II early coin portraits are instantly recognizable and appear across numerous denominations from the period. When you hold the coin today, the young queen shown on the surface takes you directly back to the early decades of her long reign. This is one reason pre-decimal British coins remain popular among collectors. They allow people to see how the appearance of British currency changed through different stages of the 20th century. Turn the coin over, and the reverse reveals a traditional figure, Britannia. She is seated and holds her familiar trident and shield, while the sea and lighthouse elements appear behind her. The denomination 1 penny is displayed as part of the reverse design, with the date 1964 positioned below. Britannia had already been a major symbol on British coinage for generations, so her presence connects this relatively modern penny with a much older tradition. Even if the coin has suffered years of wear, the overall Britannia design remains one of its most recognizable features. The reverse is especially interesting when viewed under good lighting. On an older coin, the fine details can become less pronounced, but collectors can still examine the outline of Britannia, the trident shield, lettering, and surrounding elements. Comparing a worn 1964 penny with a sharper example can show just how much detail is lost through circulation. This is why collectors do not simply look at the date. They examine the entire coin to understand its condition and identify anything that may distinguish it from a standard example. The physical specifications are another important part of identification. A standard British bronze penny from this period weighed approximately 9.45 grams and measured about 30.8 millimeters in diameter. Its bronze composition gave it the familiar appearance associated with pre-decimal pennies. When you hold one in your hand, its substantial size immediately makes it feel different from many modern low-denomination coins. However, collectors should remember that an old coin may no longer match its original weight exactly. Decades of circulation, surface wear, and corrosion can remove tiny amounts of material. For that reason, weight should always be considered alongside diameter, design, lettering, edge, and overall appearance. Now we come to one of the most important subjects in the world of coin collecting: rarity and condition. The 1964 penny is old, but age alone does not automatically make a rare or extremely valuable coin. Many British pennies were produced for circulation, and surviving examples can still be found today. Our example is described as being in an outdated condition, meaning it has a visible appearance of age and may show wear, surface marks, darkening, or other signs of a long life. Those characteristics generally place it below a highly preserved specimen in terms of condition, but they do not remove its historical interest. A collector might compare several 1964 pennies and discover that they look very different. One may have strong lettering, a clear portrait, and detailed Britannia, while another may have a much softer design with scratches and surface damage. Even though the dates are identical, the collector appeal can be very different. Better condition often increases desirability, particularly when combined with originality and an unusual feature. However, a worn coin can still be worth preserving because it represents the coin, the condition in which it survived. The big question is, of course, what could a 1964 penny be worth today in dollars? This needs to be approached carefully. A normal old-condition 1964 British penny should not automatically be described as a coin worth thousands of dollars. The real market value depends on the exact condition, authenticity, rarity, collector demand, and whether the coin has a recognized variety or genuine minting error. Without examining the actual coin, it would be irresponsible to promise a specific high value. However, let's create a dramatic fictional auction scenario purely for entertainment. Imagine an unusually rare 1964 penny with an extraordinary authenticated minting feature appearing at a major collector's auction. The bidding starts at $100. Another bidder offers $500. The price moves to $1,000, then suddenly reaches $5,000. The room becomes excited as the auctioneer announces $10,000. In our fictional story, determined collectors could even push the imaginary price to $20,000 or $50,000. These numbers make for an exciting rare coin story, but they are fictional examples and are not the normal market value of an outdated or circulated 1964 penny. The reason these hypothetical figures are useful is because they demonstrate how much difference a truly unusual characteristic could potentially make. A standard coin is one thing. A rare, authenticated variety or major mint error can be something entirely different. But Collectors must be careful. A scratch, dent, gouge, or unusual mark caused after the coin left the mint is normally considered damage, not a valuable mint error. Genuine errors have specific characteristics and need to be identified correctly. This is why professional examination becomes important when a coin appears unusual. If you have a 1964 penny, start your inspection with the date. Look closely at the numbers and make sure they appear natural and consistent. Then examine Queen Elizabeth II portrait under a bright light or magnification. Study the lettering around the portrait and look for anything that appears genuinely unusual. On the reverse, carefully inspect Britannia, the trident, shield, denomination, and date. Compare the coin with photographs of authenticated examples rather than relying on dramatic social media claims. It is also worth checking the edge. An old penny can develop marks, dents and scratches around the rim through decades of circulation. These are normal signs of use and should not automatically be interpreted as evidence of a valuable error. The key question is always whether the feature was created during the minting process or appeared later through handling, damage, or environmental exposure. Learning this distinction is one of the most valuable skills a collector can develop. Another important rule is never rush to clean an old coin. A dark, brown, or aged surface may look less attractive to someone unfamiliar with collecting, but natural surfaces can be desirable. Polishing, scrubbing, or using chemicals can create scratches and permanently alter the coin. Once that original surface has been removed, it cannot simply be restored. If you believe your 1964 penny may be interesting, keep it in its existing condition and handle it by the edges whenever possible. Proper storage is equally important. Keep the coin away from excessive moisture, harsh chemicals, and abrasive materials. A suitable protective holder can help prevent additional damage. If you have several old British coins, storing them separately can also reduce unnecessary contact and scratching. Good preservation habits can make a major difference over many years. Collectors can also benefit from keeping notes about their coins. Record the date, denomination, condition, and anything unusual you observe. Take photographs of both sides and, if necessary, the edge. If you later discover information about a particular variety, you'll already have a clear record of the coin you own. This is particularly useful if you eventually decide to have a potentially unusual example professionally examined. The 1964 penny is also a fascinating reminder of the old British monetary system. People who used this coin understood money very differently from people today. The traditional relationship between pounds, shillings, and pence was part of everyday life. A penny had a familiar role in the economy, and people knew exactly how it fitted into the wider currency system. Today, decimalization has made that system largely historical knowledge, and coins such as the 1964 penny provide a physical reminder of how Britain once handled everyday money. This historical connection gives the coin a value that cannot always be measured in dollars. A collector may appreciate a 1964 penny because it represents the early reign of Queen Elizabeth II, the final years of pre-decimal Britain, or simply because it reminds them of a family member who once collected old coins. Financial value is only one part of the collecting experience. The story behind an object can be just as important. Of course, there is always excitement when an old coin appears to have an unusual characteristic. If your 1964 penny looks different from the examples you normally see, don't immediately assume it is worthless or extraordinarily valuable. Investigate it. Compare it with trusted references. Photograph the unusual area and seek an experienced opinion if necessary. If someone claims that your coin is worth $5,000, $10,000 or more, ask them to explain exactly what makes it valuable. A serious valuation should be based on identifiable evidence rather than a dramatic number. When thinking about current market value, remember that a coin's price can be influenced by condition, rarity, authenticity, and demand. A heavily worn or outdated condition example may have limited financial value, while a beautifully preserved coin can attract greater interest. A genuine rare variety or error can potentially change the situation considerably. But no responsible collector should assume that every old penny is a hidden fortune. So, if you own a 1964 British one penny, give it the attention it deserves. Examine the Queen Elizabeth II portrait. Study Britannia. Check the date and inspect the edge. Look for genuine characteristics rather than ordinary damage. Avoid cleaning the coin and protect it from further deterioration. Most importantly, enjoy the process of discovery. You may be holding a modest historical collectible, or you may find something that deserves further investigation. As we reach the end of today's journey, the 1964 penny remains a fascinating survivor from a changing Britain. It carries the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, the traditional image of Britannia, and the date that places it within the final era of Britain's old currency system. Its outdated condition may show the marks of time, but those marks also tell us that this coin had a real life before it became a collector's object. The dramatic fictional figures we imagine today, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, and $50,000, are entertainment examples representing an extraordinary hypothetical auction. They should not be treated as guaranteed values for a normal 1964 penny. The real value of an individual coin must come from its actual condition, authenticity, rarity, recognized varieties or errors, and genuine collector demand. And perhaps that is the most exciting lesson of all. Coin collecting is not simply about finding a large number written next to a coin. It is about discovering history, learning to recognize details, and preserving small pieces of the past. The 1964 penny may have once been ordinary pocket money, but today it can transport us back to a Britain that used pounds, shillings, and pence, and was preparing for one of the biggest changes in its monetary history. So before you overlook an old penny, stop and take a closer look. Check the date. Examine both sides. Protect the surface, and learn what makes the coin different from an ordinary example. You never know what you might discover when you start looking carefully. Thank you for watching World Rare Coins Vault, and keep searching, keep learning, and keep preserving history, because sometimes an old coin that appears ordinary at first can become the beginning of a fascinating collecting story.